Aye.
Hey, Bill.
Hello, Terrence here.
Great. Then I think we're ready to begin. Okay. It's good to see everybody. Good evening. Tonight is Thursday, May 7th, and I'll make a motion to return to public session. If I could please ask Julia to second the motion.
Second.
Thank you. And Terrence, do you want to just say hello so that everybody knows you're present?
Hi, folks. I am present.
Thank you. And all in favor of returning to public session, please say aye.
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 Great. Thank you so much. Tonight, we're looking forward to continuing our budget conversation. A good bit has actually changed since last week. We have some updates from the governor that we can discuss. We're looking forward to an audit discussion and to an opportunity to review the district's safety plan and code of conduct, two annual conversations that we have at this time of year. And I'm just going to ask that we please rise in a moment for the Pledge of Allegiance as is our custom. So would everybody please join us in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag
To the
of
flag
the United States of America
America,
and to the republic
republic
for
for
which
which
it
stands
stands,
one
one
nation,
nation,
under God,
indivisible,
with liberty
and
and
justice
justice for all.
for all.
Great, thank you. We are going to do some board committee reports in a minute, but I just did want to start briefly to just mention that this would have been the second to last day of Teacher Appreciation Week in our school district, and just to thank all of our teachers and also members of the administration for their continued efforts to make sure that every student has access to meaningful learning and instruction. These are such extraordinary times. We're entering week 8 of distance learning. And last Friday, I think it was especially poignant to see a video that had been compiled of many, many high school teachers with well wishes to students in a video montage. It was great to see them. And I think we all experienced just both the pleasure of being able to see our teachers healthy in their home environments, but also the experience of missing them very much. So we miss all of you. We thank you for your tireless efforts, and we're sorry that we aren't able to celebrate in person Teacher Appreciation Week. And also, it felt appropriate just to mention that yesterday would have been an opportunity to celebrate our nurses in particular. It was annual Nursing Appreciation Day, and it feels only right to acknowledge our nurses and all of the nurses in our community for their Herculean efforts on the front line. And we thank them very much for their service. So thank you very much for just letting me say those few words. And I think we now would be turning our attention to board committee reports and then going around for some board announcements. I'll just ask for those of you who have board subcommittee reports to just maybe let me know. Julia, thank you. You want to speak first?
Sure. The audit committee met last week virtually. We were able to begin our engagement for this year's external audit of the school district. Clearly, we're very fortunate to have a really strong business team who is very comfortable with the online and sort of digital process that we may need to use if we're not able to have the audit done in person. So I feel like we're prepared for that. And certainly our auditing firm is also prepared for that. So we started that engagement, and then we had our internal audit with Dave Moran, who will be with us tonight.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. That's great. Anybody else waiting with a board subcommittee report? Did parent council meet since the last time that we met? Is there anything to report out from our parent council? No.
I think we mentioned last time that they had met just before that meeting, but we haven't met again since.
Okay, thank you. And then that brings us to board announcements. I don't know whether board members had announcements since last week. Yes, Bill, please.
I have an announcement that I decided to run for another term as trustee of the Board of Education. I think this is a time where a little bit of experience on the board might be useful. It's been an honor for the past 6 years doing this, and I'd be highly honored if I'm given another 3 years to do this.
Thank you, Bill. We appreciate you mentioning that, and that's a great impetus just for maybe a few brief words here, although we'll have an opportunity later in the meeting to turn our attention to a few agenda items that pertain to the budget vote and the election. But along the lines of what's new since the last time we met on Friday of last week, of course, the governor informed us that we will be voting, our community will be voting on our annual budget in a very new manner. And thank you to the administration for acting so quickly, and to Kim Monson for all of the research that has gone on behind the scenes so that we are going to be well positioned to have a smooth budget vote. Thank you for the Q&A that was made available last night on our website. We really appreciate you responding so quickly to what is just a very significant challenge associated with how we're going to execute this budget vote and facilitate a smooth election. So I'm sure, as I mentioned, we'll be able to talk more about that in a little while, but thank you, Bill, for sharing your update with us. Any other announcements?
Hey, Marjorie, this is Terrence. I just wanted to give a shout out to Mrs. Lambert, second grade teacher at Increase Miller, and my daughter's in her class, and she did something that was really neat, which is, you know, I think a lot of us have heard of the Flat Stanley project, initiative, phenomenon. I don't know exactly what to call Flat Stanley, but to keep her students engaged, she did a Flat Mrs. Lambert, and she created a little figure and mailed it to all the students. And so I thought it was just a really kind of fun, neat, and just really personal way of trying to stay connected to her students. And I know that many of our teachers in the district are doing things like that now. So, you know, in a time of crisis, it really shows character. And I just wanted to make sure that Mrs. Lambert and our teachers who are doing these kinds of things get some recognition and credit for it.
That's really nicely said, Terrence. Thank you for sharing that. And I think your words remind all of us of individual experiences that our own children, or even we as parents, are having, and other members of the community who've shared with us are having, of just really seeing our teachers go to great lengths to ensure that our students feel seen and heard, even from a distance. And you know, your example is just really a perfect testament to that. So thank you. If there aren't any other announcements at this time, then I know we'd love to hear from Andrew if you have some announcements for us.
I do. They overlap a little bit with some of what you were just saying, Marjorie.
Thank you.
But certainly I want to echo the thanks to all of our staff in Teacher Appreciation Week and Nurse Appreciation Day. We are incredibly grateful to all the ongoing work that everybody continues to do. It's really been great. And as Marjorie also mentioned, it was just last Friday after our meeting on Thursday night that the governor made his announcement about schools being closed for the remainder of this year. I have had some questions from community about exactly what that means. And as with many things these days, we're not exactly sure what the last day of school will be. We imagine it will still be June 26th, which is currently slated. But some people have correctly pointed out with the Regents exams being canceled that last day is typically tied to the rating day for the Regents exams. So there's been some questions in light of spring break, for example, not happening and school continuing through spring break. I've had some questions about that, and we're waiting, and we expect that we'll get some guidance from the state on what's expected for the remainder of this year. So as soon as we know that information, we will share it with the community. And then again, I want to echo the point about the budget vote and the Board of Ed elections. And refer people to the district website if you haven't been there yet. There's a lot of information there, but as Marjorie said, we will be mailing ballots to every registered voter in the community. We hope to mail them during the week of May 18th. So watch your mail that week. We hope that we know that mail service has had its own challenges in light of the crisis. So we're mailing them as early as we possibly can. And importantly, we're encouraging voters to mail them back as early as you possibly can. So the official date is June 9th of the election, But honestly, as soon as you get your ballots, you can turn them around, put them back in the correct envelope, and return them to us. The sooner the better, because we don't know how long the mail will take. And importantly, in the governor's announcement, it's not the date that you mail it that's important, it's the date that we receive it that's important. And we must receive all eligible ballots by 5 p.m. on June 9th. We appreciate Bill making his announcement a few minutes ago. Anyone who is interested in also being a candidate for the Board of Ed, there's a petition to be picked up through Kim Monsen's office, our board clerk, and those petitions must be returned to her by 5 o'clock on Monday, May 11th, if you wish to be a candidate, a written candidate, a printed candidate on that ballot that you'll be receiving at home. And last thing I'll say will be, well, we'll say this again later when we talk about the budget, but there'll be a public budget hearing on May 28th in advance of the date of the vote. So that's it from me for tonight before we get into the budget a little bit later on.
Okay, terrific. Thank you.
Sure.
I think this brings us up to item 10.01, which is our opportunity to invite Dave Moran to speak with us from Acume Partners about our audit and a risk assessment. So I'll just pause while we're setting Dave up to speak.
And just like that.
Terrific. Welcome. Nice to see you, Dave.
Hi, Dave.
Always a pleasure. Unusual to see you all quite like this, but it's still a pleasure.
Terrific. Thank you.
Okay. 2 reports for this evening. One is, the first one I'll be talking about will be the internal audit that we performed as a result of the board's concurrence and approval of last year's risk assessment update. And that was in the area of revenue and accounts receivable. And if you all remember, there was a question about the timeliness of the payments that were coming across from the towns and what have you, and that's kind of what spurred this. So that occurred with us doing the formal audit. And let's see, Kim, is this thing going to show up somewhere, or am I just going to be talking? Hello?
I think Kim's sharing her screen, Dave.
There we go. All right, great. All right, we can go to the next page. Okay, the audit scope and objectives. We looked at the period from July 1st of 2018 through June 30th of 19. And the objectives were to ensure the following, and that was the overall design and operational effectiveness of the internal controls, and then to look at compliance with policies and procedures and applicable regulations regarding the property tax processing, collections, and then, of course, the miscellaneous billing and accounts receivable. And that's what we did. And in order to do that, the next slide will tell you. What we did was to interview the appropriate business office staff, review existing board and department level policies and procedures, and then we reviewed the major processes, specifically property tax issuance and collection, miscellaneous billing and accounts receivable, and then once we were comfortable with the procedures as they were defined and the appropriate regulations, we identified and tested the key internal controls. And that resulted in the next page, which talks about the audit ratings, which we talk about every year. And you want to be the first one, satisfactory. You don't want to be a needs improvement or an unsatisfactory. And we talked about the fact that we don't give you a letter grade like A, B, or C. This is just the way we do it. So there you have it. The next slide will tell you that the recommendations, well, the next slide will tell you the most important thing at the top, and that is that the audit rating overall was satisfactory. And then we did have some areas of improvement, and I should, what's the phrase they use now? Give a shout out to the office, the office staff, and David Quattrochi and the folks that worked in this area, including Kim Parks and Danelle, because the few recommendations that we had, not only did they agree with them, they implemented them immediately. So my hat is off to that, and right now they're humming along. We did develop, we recommended that there be a formal procedure for receiving and processing property tax collections. There was a process, it just wasn't really documented that well, and they have now done that. And then we also said it's probably be a good idea to look at the property tax receipt reconciliations and reviews and do it on a periodic basis. That has been implemented. They were doing fine, and they still are doing fine with the controls over the collection, receiving, and processing of miscellaneous, so just keep going. And then we also talked about a periodic independent review procedure for recording of the revenue for the non-tax revenue and accounts receivable. And again, we already had segregation of duties, but this was a more precise, if you will, documentation and acknowledgement that it was done. In many instances, in many of the school districts, there is segregation of duties and it works very well, but people sometimes don't put their initials next to it, so we're never sure that it was done. That's not the case here. I'm just saying these are the kinds of improvements we like to see made. And then finally, the bank account reconciliations are fine. Keep doing what you're doing. So that's the 10,000 foot flyover. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Dave, to you and your team for spending time in our district, so to speak, and for the thorough analysis. We appreciate it. Are there any questions or comments from board members? I'll just pause for a minute. Perhaps we should move on to the risk assessment.
That will be fine. And I, you know, and in all fairness to the audit committee, who does a very good oversight job, we obviously met with them and went over this report, and then we also met with them and went over the risk assessment update, which is the next item. And the process, as you know, this is not an audit. This is to look at the various operations and activities. I should point out that there's probably one qualification, and that is that when we did the risk assessment update, we did not know what a coronavirus was, okay? And as a result, we were looking at the activities and operations and controls of the district under the normal environment. Because of that, we will, however, in any areas that we recommend, in the area that we recommend we audit here, we will be revising as appropriate the necessary steps being observed for the processing and the controls under the current environment that we are faced with. And that means, and that means that, yes, if in fact the business office is operating in such a way that people are only coming in for, you know, a half day or periodically or something like that, then that's what we'll do too, okay? And whatever we can handle from our offices at home, we will do that as well. We don't want to, you know, put any requirements on anybody in the district from our standpoint of forcing them to come in if it's not appropriate or if it's not applicable or if it's not necessary. So that's kind of where we're going. What we did, and you see that on the slide before you, was the necessary interviews. We also looked at information technology, reviewed the documentation, and then determined if there were any significant changes to the control environment. Again, this was before. And we confirmed our understanding of the key processes. We updated our proprietary risk assessment matrix, and we then summarized it in the report and made the recommendation for the area to be audited. Next slide, please. And this is the definition of risk. I don't think we need to belabor it because the only point that we need to make here is that sometimes you're going to have things rated as high because of the sheer magnitude of the dollars involved, or the process, how overreaching, how extended it may be, the materiality and things of that nature. Having said that, when we then finished updating the matrix, as you'll see, the district has no high risk areas, or rated as high risk. So what you see is last year and then this year's, and you'll notice that it looks like there's no change. There is no change in the major categories of high, medium, or low. But as you know, we do this on a weighted average, and it's a numeric average. So there were some changes, okay, but nothing that caused a change in the overall rating. Information technology went up a few points, and that's primarily because of the new Ed 2 laws and things that have been introduced. And although you're working on it, you know, it isn't totally complete yet. But again, it wasn't enough to drive it into a high risk rating. Having said that, the area that we looked at in terms of evaluating where to go next and discussed with both the business office as well as the audit committee, the one we selected, which is on the next page, I believe, was to look at human resources and payroll. And again, one of the, the highest dollar amounts and one of the most significant areas. And let's face it, it's one that suddenly, if we're going to be doing this in a remote atmosphere, what is that, how does that work? So it was decided and agreed upon to recommend that this area be done. The scope would primarily look at, as you can see, the 3 bullets there, the obtaining, verifying, and processing of personnel information. And that involves, the hiring, the onboarding, the termination, everything that's involved with that. And then, of course, the timekeeping and attendance reporting to check on the accuracy, timeliness, and what have you. And then finally, the processing, verifying, and certification of the district payroll. So those were the areas that we would be looking at, and that was the area that we recommended. And I'll throw it out for questions.
I don't have a question, but I just wanted to say thanks to Dave and his team, and just to assure the community that at the audit committee, we have a very lengthy discussion about which area we think is appropriate to audit. We kind of go through different areas. We see those numerical ratings, so we can see, even if it's an uptick of 1 or 2 points, might be medium to medium, but we see what those numbers are, and really try to think through, is this the right area for this year? Is there an area we haven't done an internal audit on in several years, et cetera? So, Dave's presenting a pretty high level presentation, which is great. And, but I just want to, be clear that we have a pretty long discussion relative to this with our committee. And I also know he's, very connected to our business office. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Any further questions?
Just one quick thought, Margaret. I'd also like to commend the audit committee for sure, and the various the business office and others who contributed to the satisfactory audit. It's really very nice to not have to deliberate over an audit when it comes in as just plain satisfactory. So that's great. You mentioned the Ed2 law and the fact that the IT risk has increased, and certainly I know we are working on that. Is there a reason why that wasn't selected and we chose HR and payroll over IT?
Yes. The primary reason was we just did do an IT audit and a cybersecurity review also.
Thank you. That's helpful. Thank you.
Any other discussion or questions? If not, then let me please just reiterate, we appreciate your team spending time with us, Dave, and we thank you, Dave Quattrochi and Danelle and the entire business office for your fiscal stewardship and for putting us in a position to be able to feel safe and secure and that our audit is going to come back satisfactory. This was great news, and we really appreciate all that goes into the integrity of our processes behind the scenes. Protection of the resources. Thank you. Thank you.
David, thank you for presenting.
Well, it's always a pleasure, and I should also add my thanks to the fine level of cooperation we get from the district and everybody involved. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
you
Dave.
for joining us. Be safe. Take care.
Okay.
Thank you, Sharon, too.
Thank you.
Good luck, folks. All right.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Care.
Okay, great. Thank you. And I think now we're going to turn our attention to a few revisions to the Code of Conduct. And again, just a reminder, this is an annual requirement of the Board of Education to review changes to the Code of Conduct and to the school district safety plan. And we're in the fortunate position of already being able to review these documents so that we can come back and adopt them at our reorg meeting and meet the required timeline for public hearing or notice, the 30-day window. It was a little bit surreal to review these documents now from a distance and in the middle of a pandemic, I have to admit. I'm sure you probably experienced that to some extent too, but we really appreciate you bringing these, and we are looking forward to hearing about any changes. So I guess we'll start with the Code of Conduct.
Sure. So tonight, I think, yep, here's the presentation. Kim's going to bring that up as well.
Thank you.
So this is our annual review of the Code of Conduct. You can go right to the next slide. I was just going to speak what Marjorie just said, that this is our annual public comment period. We'll present this tonight, and then the public will have time to think about this, and we'll adopt it at the annual reorg meeting in July. So I would just want to walk you through a little bit of the Code of Conduct review process. First, I want to thank the members of the Code of Conduct review team. This year was various building level administrators, teachers, our school resource officers sat on the committee. And thank you, Liz Garrity. She was our Board of Ed trustee who sat in on the committee. So the review process starts at the attorney levels. They get our current Code of Conduct that goes to them for any revisions or regulations that may change. Then the committee gets to review that first initial document. We discuss it at length. After we decide on some changes, it goes back to our attorney. And a few weeks after that, the committee met again to review the changes that the attorney incorporated based on our recommendations. And then finally, we sent a finalized document, and that was the draft that the board sees tonight. It has been reviewed at Ingram and Smith. So the committee had many lengthy discussions about the document, but ultimately few changes were made this year. We combined what the committee felt was a redundancy in the listing of disciplinary actions. There were separate disciplinary actions for various behaviors, and then separate was bullying behaviors, and we felt just for consistency reasons and to succinct the document that we would merge those. Then we also discussed a form that is mentioned in the Code of Conduct for disciplinary actions. We did a little research and just updated the origination of that form. And then finally, just some minor formatting issues on the document to make it consistent and more easily readable. So it was not much to say, but a lot of work did go into this with all the members of the team. So at this point, I'm going to open this up. Does the board have any questions or clarifying topics they'd like to discuss?
You looked great. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you to the committee, and thank you for walking us through the process.
I think I'm up next with the district-wide safety plan as well. So this again is an annual requirement. The district-wide safety plan will be adopted at the annual reorg in July. So this is this allows enough time for the public to make comments. Project SAVE was enacted in the year 2000 as a result of the tragic events that happened in Columbine. It led to the legislation for proactive measures for serious crisis situations such as national disasters, school violence, and death of a school member. The Project SAVE Act recognizes that learning cannot happen in an unsafe environment, and parents need to be assured that their children are in a safe place. The SAVE Act requires that school districts define how a school district will respond to violence and disasters through prevention, intervention, and emergency response management. Last year, we updated policy number 8130, and that just included that the board recognizes the importance of the emergency planning. It also says that it's still the responsibility of administrators to provide effective emergency plans and provide training. So we also had an annual plan review. We held this with several members of the community. Again, thank you for all that attended. This year we had teachers, we had our school clinicians, we had members of our district crisis team meeting, some members of the school crisis team meeting. We had our school resource officer, also some representative from Country Children's Center showed, and Vista Fire Department also sent a representative. So you may recall that in September, we had to modify this plan It was an SED regulation to define what the school resource officer's role were. So we did update this plan after it was adopted in July. So since then, the changes included just updating team members and adding pandemic in the list of emergencies. So you can see on the screen the definition of emergency, which is undesirable events that occur and have potential to cause injury or illness to members of our school community or disrupt the orderly education process. So this has been in our plan for years, and right now we're in it. So we have quite a bit comprehensive safety plan. It meets all the New York State SED requirements. We are kind of bound by what we can have in this particular plan because of the mandates involved. Our district-wide safety plan not only meets the mandates, you can go to the next slide, Kim. Thank you. But also provides information on helping to minimize the effect of emergencies, and it's designated to protect against harm and to mitigate damages. The district-wide and building level plans are filed with SED each year. We also send a copy to our local police departments. The district-wide plan will be posted on our website. The school plans, however, are more confidential, so those are not posted and they have more sensitive information. So there are some mandates that Project Save requires. The first is that employees are trained annually. Every single employee down to our cafeteria workers are trained to recognize some mental health components. District and building level crisis teams, they meet on a regular basis. And then SED has a list of emergency drills that we comply with based on their timelines. So in summary, our schools must remain a safe place, and Katona Lewis Borough is committed to providing a school safe environment by using such tools as this plan. This plan sets the framework for emergency management. And that sums it up. Again, I open this up for questions, clarifying comments.
Thank you very much for the overview, Danelle.
Thank you.
Any thoughts or comments, feedback? We appreciate you drawing our attention to the updates and your thoughtfulness. I don't have any further questions on this either.
All right, well then I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, moving on then to 10.04, which is our opportunity to continue discussion of the proposed budget.
Okay, Kim, am I going to share my screen on this one? I think so, yeah. Okay, so just give me a moment. And okay, so this is the night when we asked the board to consider adopting the budget that we've now been discussing for quite some time, perhaps a little bit longer in terms of the calendar year than we typically would due to the crisis that we've been in. I'm going to move relatively quickly through particularly the first part of the budget presentation because the board is so familiar with this. We've done this a number of times. And in the first part, there are really not changes. There are some adjustments in the second part of the presentation as a result of the situation we've been in. So we certainly want to spend a little bit more time on those. We always begin our budget presentation with our learning commitment. Hopefully everyone's familiar with this by now, our engaging, relevant, and active learning environment that we work so hard to create. We remind everybody of the board's goals around leadership on this first goal, and then the second one, particularly the importance of fiscal stewardship that we know the board takes very seriously and that we strive to meet their expectations. And so that's sets the parameters for the development of this budget. The timeline, as I just mentioned, we started all the way back in September with those goals. And this year down at the bottom where it says budget is developed from December to February, that's been drawn out a little bit longer this year because of the situation that we find ourselves in and the need to make some changes and adjustments as these challenging days have gone on. The enrollment, I'll stay on this one for a moment just to point out that Though the enrollment decline has continued, it has flattened out, a different kind of flattening of the curve in this case. And you can see that from this year to next year, and this was a projection that we made several months ago, we were projecting just a very small decrease of about 14 students. And I would say this is, while we always say it's an unknown when we're projecting the number, it's even more unknown, I would say, in light of the current economic situation. There are a number of districts, ourselves included, that are wondering whether the change in the financial environment would see more students perhaps returning from private schools to the public schools. We don't know about that yet, but we'll certainly be watching for that and be ready with the budget that we're proposing. So I just wanted to mention that as we were going through it. And I should have, I'm just adjusting my screen here. So please don't hesitate to ask questions to the board members if you have them at any time. The next slide here shows the proposed budget. And you can see here there is a proposed increase in the budget. This year's budget, $110 million, $169,000. Next year, we're proposing $111,472,000. That's an increase of $1.3 million, or a 1.18% increase in the budget. Very importantly, and I can't say this clearly enough, we are not asking the taxpayers for any additional contribution. That increase, which we'll say more about later on, is accounted for entirely by other revenue increases, not by taxpayer increases, not by collective taxpayer increases, I should say, for the next year. So we'll say more about that later on, but there is a little bit of an increase there. The drivers of the budget, we always talk about the school programs that we want to offer, the professional learning that's so important, the enrollment in the class size, and the infrastructure changes. And these are some of the slides, again, that the board has seen a number of times. I'm not going to dwell on them tonight because we have other things that I imagine people might want to spend a little bit more time on. But we're very excited about the enhancements that you see here on the slide and that we've discussed previously. Enhanced opportunities for professional learning, also very, very important, maybe even more so now than ever before, as we're in such a different environment and our teachers are learning to do things in ways that they've never done them before. We're all learning to do things in ways that we've never done them before. Class size, always important to us. We don't know the environment that we'll be returning to school in the fall. We don't know what the restrictions will be. So we've asked the board to once again include these 4 contingency positions that would allow us, if we run into trouble with the size of our classes, or if we find the students are making elective choices that are harder for us to fill in the secondary schools. These give us the flexibility to provide programming and to keep class sizes at a reasonable size. As we'll say more about where there's potential savings in that area later. And then we're hopeful, we're still hopeful to be able to do some significant renovation projects with this budget in the next year. The high school auditorium renovation, new bleachers in the gym, and a necessary fire suppression upgrade of KES. But I will mention right now that particularly those first 2 items are items that may not be able to happen depending on the cuts that we see in state aid in the coming year. And I'll say more about that in a little bit. Enrollment, we've mentioned again before. Kindergarten, always the most difficult number to project. You can see there we're projecting an increase in next year's kindergarten from the current year for about 20 students. So you see 1 additional section there to account for that. Again, elementary class sizes here, all in good shape, and we have been through these with the board previously. So unless there are questions, I'm going to move fairly quickly through the class sizes. They're all pretty comparable to one another and pretty comparable to what they are in the current year. The middle school sections, you see here again, in the middle school now, where our elementary schools are relatively flat in terms of their size now, we're seeing the decrease in size in the middle school, which you see here in that number in the middle of the page, 668 becoming 656. And we'll also see a little bit of decline in the high school, but we're still have favorable class sizes, which you can see down here on this part of the slide. The high school also currently projected to decline in size a bit next year. And again, we don't know whether that will change now in light of the financial situation that the world finds itself in. That takes us to staffing changes. The staffing changes very much match the population shifts. So the increase that you see there at the top occurs in elementary school, but then you see we're also asking for the additional psychologist position to support social emotional work at the elementary school levels. But then you also see decreases down here, so that the overall increase that we're asking for in terms of teaching staff is a 1.65 increase. As it notes at the bottom, that does not include the contingency positions. But then when we go to the next page, you see that we are making some decreases in the category of aides and in bus drivers and in clerical staff. And it's so that the overall, with an increase in teaching staff at the bottom and then a decrease in support staff, it's an overall slight decrease in staffing for next year. So now we move into the budget analysis, and this is where we have made some adjustments from earlier presentations. Again, the board has seen these changes previously, but we'll say them now for the community. You see again here the same increase in the budget, and here's where you first see reflected that the tax levy proposed for next year, this 97,948,497 number, is exactly the same as the number above it for this year. So we are not asking the taxpayers to contribute any additional funds collectively for next year. And what this indicates, you know, we always have this slide in to show that the average budget change now going back over this 6-year period, including next year, we're showing an average increase of just 0.06% in the budget side. And the tax levy change over this time period is still slightly in the negative as an average, negative 0.18% in terms of the tax levy that we're asking for. So we think that that's a responsible place to be in. This slide shows you some of the increases where they occur in the budget. You can see an increase in the interfund transfer, some salary increases, and other increases on this page. Those are balanced out a little bit by the decrease, but because there is an overall increase in the budget, they're not balanced out completely. And then we talk about the levy here. We always remind people, whoops, I don't know how to go backwards. There we go. That we often think that this tax cap is a 2% cap. In fact, it's 2% or CPI, whichever is lower. And in this year, with the consumer price index for 2019 finishing at 1.8% and an assessment growth factor of 1.0032, we'll show you now what that means in terms of what the tax cap for us could have been versus what it actually is. So this is the formula that we use. I won't go through this in a lot of detail here, but just skip to the end to say, after the various calculations that we're required to make, that number there at the bottom of the screen, the $100,032,140, is what the maximum tax levy that we could, by law, have be asking the taxpayers to contribute and still be compliant with the tax cap laws in New York State. But we are not asking for that. Remember, we're asking for a number that is, as you see here, a little bit more than $2 million lower than the allowable levy limit. So that's explained in this third bullet point here. We are not asking the voters for any more than they're contributing this year. As a result, this budget requires a simple majority vote, just one more than 50% of those voting. If we had gone over the cap of that 100 million, it would have required the 60% vote to pass, but we are not doing that. We're going to say a little bit more about a contingent budget, which you see mentioned here down at the bottom, because that situation we anticipate may have changed a little bit. This is the slide that we did present a couple of meetings ago to the board to show where we had made some adjustments. This column here for 2021 was originally what we were proposing in terms of revenue, anticipated revenue. We adjusted those numbers based on some of what we were hearing from the state, as well as just some knowledge of what's happening around us in terms of interest rates and sales tax revenue and that kind of thing. So we did make some adjustments here. We made a decrease of 150,000 here in anticipated interest earnings. We made a decrease here in state aid. I'll stop here for a moment to say the important thing here, and particularly with the state aid, is that the governor in the coming year has the authority in a way that he has not in the past, but he has the authority to make reductions throughout the year. So in addition to this negative 377,000 you see here, we do anticipate there may well be, and likely will be, additional reductions in the coming year. We're not showing them here yet because we'd be guessing at what they would be. So rather than guess, we're leaving that number as what it's sort of currently projected. And then, as we've said before, we've identified some areas where we would not make expenditures if we don't receive some of the revenues that we anticipate. And the reason that the number here at the bottom, the 111 million in revenue, is the same as it is over here, even though we decreased some of these numbers, we increased the fund balance by $500,000 here. So carrying over funds from this year into next to offset next year's budget. And this just shows, again, the difference really in terms of it really points out that the levy that we're asking for is the same down there at the bottom of the slide from this year to next year. And though other revenue we're anticipating to be slightly higher at this point, though we think that'll change, it's the appropriated fund balance where we're making up the difference, and that's how the budget can increase even though the levy is staying the same. Into the tax rates, and we always try very hard to make the point that these are that these numbers will change, or very, very likely to change, when the assessor finalizes their calculations later this year. So these are projections at this point. And so, and this is where we do point out that, and it's always the case because of the need to equalize the payments among the different towns that support our schools. Some of the towns see a slight decrease in their tax rate, while others see a slight increase. You can see that here. So Bedford is seeing a decrease, a negative 3.3, while Lewisboro sees a small increase of 2.5. On the next slide, you'll see that North Salem and Pound Ridge both see decreases. Unfortunately, those numbers are out of our control. What is in our control is setting the levy in total, and that's the number that we've kept flat. So this is a summary slide, goes over some of those things that we're excited to add in the budget, shows again the total at the bottom, shows the percentage increase. Here's, again, we've discussed this with the board previously. These are the areas where if we don't receive the state aid that we're anticipating, which we think is at this point quite likely, we expect to hear more any day now from the state actually, then these are areas where we think we can account for some savings. There are supplies that we would attempt to purchase out of remaining budget this year if possible, so as not to have to make those purchases next year. We would make a reduction in the transfer to capital fund, and that's where those projects that we're excited about in the high school auditorium and in the gym, they may not be able to happen if we don't receive a significant amount of funding, but we think it's better not to do projects like that in such a tough environment and avoid having direct impact in the classrooms by having to cut positions or cut programs. We would always work hard to avoid that. We'll be more conservative in our use of those contingency positions if necessary if we don't see the state aid coming in, and we would hold off on other non-essential equipment purchases in the coming year, all in order to, and we think that those items likely account for enough that if we see a pretty significant decrease in the state aid, we think that these items would be enough to offset that decrease. Okay, we take a minute here. This is a slide that is new in tonight's presentation to explain the contingent budget. There's always a contingent budget possibility. As we say there in the first bullet point, in a typical year, not this year, if a budget's voted down by the community, the board always has the option to put it back up for a second vote. It can either put up the same budget again, or it can revise its budget and put it out for a second vote. If the budget's voted down a second time, then the Board of Ed must adopt a contingent budget. And in a contingent budget, the tax levy can be no greater than the prior year's tax levy, which again, you see that same number there. So in our case, there's no difference in a contingent budget in the tax levy. However, The next bullet says a contingent budget must also reduce any non-contingent items. And there are certain items that the state identifies where we are not allowed to spend money if we end up in a contingent budget situation. And we've looked at those items and we've calculated that if we are required to go to a contingent budget, there would in fact be an additional $1.4 million that we would have to remove from the total budget. The tax levy would stay the same, but we would have to remove those expenditures from the budget in other ways and not spend the money on those items. So then this next point is important. So as we said at the beginning of the meeting tonight, this year we are running the budget vote by mail, entirely by absentee ballot at the governor's direction. And those ballots are due back to us before 5 o'clock on June 9th. And then it'll take us a little bit of time to count the ballots that come in, and then we'll be able to announce the results. What we're not at all certain about is whether between June 9th or June 10th, when we anticipate having results, we would have time, if the budget were voted down, to run a second vote by absentee ballot. And there has not at this point been any guidance from the state on this matter. You can imagine there's a lot of interest among school districts, but in the absence of guidance, we have to consider the possibility that if the budget were voted down that one time, it's possible that we may have to go to a contingency budget after a single budget vote and not have the opportunity for a second budget vote this year. We don't know. There may be some guidance between now and the time of the vote, but at this time, we don't have the guidance. So we just wanted to make sure that the board and the community understood what a contingent budget means, and particularly in a year in which the tax levy is flat, because we could understand if there would be some confusion. Some people might imagine that there really wouldn't be any difference between a flat tax levy budget and a contingent budget. But as we're pointing out here, there is a difference. There's an additional $1.4 million that we would have to remove from the budget if we went into that contingent situation. The next slides point to the propositions that would be on the ballots that people will be receiving this year at home in the mail. There will once again be two propositions, as our voters are used to seeing in prior years. The first proposition, number one, is the budget itself. This is the one that gives the school district the authority to levy taxes, to put them towards the budget. That's the amount is stated there, $111 million. And the second proposition that voters would be voting on is another bus proposition, as we've had in prior years. We do need to replace some buses that are aging out, that have significant mileage on them. The total cost you can see down there towards the bottom of $725,600. And we always are careful to point out that this is money that we would take from the current year's budget. We are not asking the voters to give additional funds to go towards these buses out of next year's budget or anything like that. We simply have to ask the permission to use funds that exist in this year's budget to purchase these buses. So that's what you would be voting on with the second proposition. Here's the timeline for the remainder of the year. Obviously, the dates that have already happened, a number of dates this year crossed out for obvious reasons. Down at the bottom, though, we're down at May 7th with the proposing the adoption of the budget tonight for the board. On May 28th, we will meet again and hold the annually required public budget hearing. And then I put an asterisk next to the June 9th date because we don't want people to mistakenly think that's the date on which to vote, even though the state is calling that the official date of the vote. As soon as you receive your ballot in the mail, we encourage you to put it back in it, to conduct your vote at home, to put the appropriate marks on the piece of paper, put it back in the appropriate envelope, and put it back in the mail as quickly as you can so that we receive it no later than 5 o'clock on June 9th. And that is the final slide. So at this time, we certainly want to hear any questions that board members might have. I hope I didn't do that too fast.
Oh, thank you. We really appreciate you taking us through the budget proposal from the beginning, and we also appreciate you raising awareness around the possible timeline that would cause us to go to a contingency budget sooner than we might need to in other years. I think it's really important to be aware of the truncated timeline between the first budget vote and when we would need to potentially take some recourse if the budget vote were not successful. So that's very important to note. And also just to go back, because we have now had so many of these opportunities to revisit the budget in light of rapidly changing extreme circumstances, to say that we really appreciate your leadership and the efforts of your entire team to look for opportunities to respond to the current circumstances and to ensure that we are able to adhere to a flat levy and to find some flexible opportunities to modify the budget between February, when we first started our very smooth deliberations, and now, so that we're well positioned still to be able to meet the educational needs of all of our students while being mindful of our fiscal responsibility to propose a flat levy, which is really important to us. So thank you so much for the overview, and I'm happy to pause if board members have any questions or comments at this point. While everybody's gathering their thoughts, I'll just point out that next we're going to have the opportunity to vote on a series of resolutions pertaining to the budget and our opportunity to adopt the budget and to move forward with also the bus proposition. But while we're doing that, I'll also mention for any community members who are with us this evening that shortly thereafter we will pause for public forum. So please feel free to use the Q&A functionality at the bottom of Zoom, and as long as the comment is not anonymous, if you could kindly please identify yourself, then we'll be happy to read the questions into public forum, and then we can take a few moments perhaps during board dialogue to answer any questions that we feel are appropriate to answer tonight, or to figure out how to thoughtfully respond to questions in the future. Any comments or feedback on the budget before we move on to 11? Yes, Roy.
Just one quick question, Marjorie. So I was very interested and thankful and grateful that Andrew, thank you for highlighting the fact that a contingency budget may be a little more imminent than we might otherwise have thought this year. I know certain items are considered non-contingent, and I know one of those is the purchasing of school buses. So you just mentioned that this year the purchasing of school buses would come from this budget. If we adopted a non-contingent budget next year, does that mean that we would be in a very awkward position in terms of purchasing new school buses? And are there other major categories that are non-contingent in that 1.4 by which we would have to reduce the budget?
I'm gonna turn to my colleagues here, Dave and Danelle, and ask them to speak to that question.
Well, yes, the resolution for the buses is authorizing funds to come out of this year's funds, as opposed to the contingent is for the 2020-21 budget.
Right.
And
so does that mean that next year, I believe that's non-contingent, I may be wrong on that, but I thought that I read that. Does that mean that next year then we would not have a fund to fund purchasing of buses next year, because if we were to adopt a non-contingent budget?
We may not be able to. I think it would, if we came with another proposition next year, we would probably be allowed to. Since then it's different, okay. They're actually voting on the new proposition as opposed to the budget itself.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you, David.
You're welcome.
Marjorie, can I make a comment? This is Terrence.
Yes, please, Terrence, go ahead.
Sure. I just wanted to say that I think we're in really good shape. I would say that this, given all that is going on right now, to have a budget that does not increase the burden on the taxpayers, that still allows the district to deliver a high level, high quality education for all of our students, and gives us flexibility to make maneuvers, again, without damaging academics, and still just being able to have options in this environment, I think speaks to the real thoughtful approach and the skill. And again, I've said in previous meetings, this is, I don't think, an accident. I think it's probably the result of a lot of really great work that's been done through the years up to this point. So I think it's a very responsible budget, and I just want to give the administration credit for that.
Thank you.
Thank you. If there isn't any further discussion at this time, I think we can continue with our agenda, and this would bring us to 11.01. And this is our resolution to establish our budget in the amount of $111,472,680. So I'll go ahead and move this resolution. If I can ask Scott to please second the resolution. Thank you, Julia. I'm sorry, I didn't see your hand, Julia. I'll get you next time. Thank you. I was looking at board docs. And if there's no further discussion, then we'll vote. So all in favor, please say aye.
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 And
Aye.
thank you, Terrence. Great, so that's 7-0, terrific. And next we have 11.02, which is our opportunity to pass a resolution for our bus proposition. And again, this is requesting permission to transfer money from our existing funds in the amount of $725,600 so that we can maintain our bus replacement cycle. And I'll go ahead and move this resolution. And here, Julia, can I ask you to please second?
Have seconded.
Thank you. And all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Terrific. So
Aye.
that's, thank you, Terrence. 7-0. And Kim, I'm just going to assume, unless you tell me otherwise, that I should continue to move these resolutions separately, 11.0345, and vote on them separately.
You can vote on those three together if you'd like.
Okay, thank you very much. So then I'm going to suggest that we move 11.03 to 11.05. This is establishing our property tax report card regarding authorization for the district clerk to give notice of our June 9th, 2020 annual budget vote and election, and regarding an amendment pertaining to the budget vote and meeting date. So I'll move all three of those. If I could ask Bill to please second all of those.
Second.
Thank you. All in favor, please say aye.
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 Okay,
Aye.
great. Thank you so much. And again, it just feels appropriate to say thank you to the administration, to those of you who are present, and to our administrators who might be with us as attendees or throughout our school district for all that has gone into the thoughtful preparation of this budget. We feel very grateful for your thoughtfulness and flexibility over the past couple of months, adjusting to circumstances as they've unfolded. And I heard you use the language earlier, Andrew. We're very excited about certain aspects of this budget, and we don't want it to be lost in all of this, that we're very excited about this budget too. We feel really positive about the ways that it's going to meet the needs of all of our students, and also about the ways in which it's responsive to the exigencies of our taxpayers. So thank you so very much. And that brings us to our public forum. Thank you to members of the community for being with us tonight. We have a few questions from Lee Presser, and please just bear with us because this format's a little bit new, but I think I'm going to read your questions, and then because we don't engage in back and forth during board dialogue, we're just going to allow ourselves to hear your questions, gather our thoughts, and there will be an opportunity later in board dialogue if it feels appropriate and we are in the position to provide some information, then we certainly will. So what is the cost of each absentee ballot mailing, and who picks up the cost of each mailing? Perhaps if mailing cost is on the district, perhaps it's already included in the budget, so perhaps we can provide some clarification around anticipated costs of this new format for administering the vote. What happens to the bus purchase if homeschooling continues into next year? Can it be delayed so that new buses are not sitting idle? And to my knowledge, those are all of the inquiries that have come in so far. So for the time being, I'm just going to move us along into the consent agenda. And to my knowledge, we don't have any items in the consent agenda that we wanted to vote on separately. So would somebody like to move the consent agenda?
Move.
Thank you. Thank you. Liz is going to move the consent agenda. Would somebody like to second it?
Second.
Okay, thank you. Seconded by Julia. And is there any discussion or were there any clarification questions? Yes, Bill.
I just wanted to congratulate you for being on the slate of secretary of the WPB, what I think they're all the initials. Wonderful.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that, and I'm looking forward to it. It's a wonderful group. I feel fortunate to be part of West Put, as we like to call ourselves, the Westchester Putnam County School Board Association. And yes, I'll be the secretary in the coming year. So thank you for that. I appreciate the kind words. Any further discussion or comments, questions? Okay, if not, then we can go ahead and vote. So all in favor, please say aye.
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 Aye. Terrific.
Aye.
Thank you, Terrence. And this brings us to our opportunity to accept a couple of very generous donations. So now I'm at 18.01, and I'm going to move a resolution to accept a gift from Increase Miller PTO. This is for 370 ebooks valued at $3,505.78. And the recipient will be Increase Miller Elementary School Library. And then a separate donation from Special Olympics in the amount of $1,000 for John Jay Unified Sports. So thank you so very much to Increase Miller, PTO, Special Olympics. May I have a second for the resolution? Sorry. Thank you, Lori. Thank you for seconding. Thank you. And all in favor, if we're ready to vote, please say aye.
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 Okay, thank you very much. And now we're at board dialogue and discussion. So I'm not sure whether board members or members of the administration had any other topics that we wanted to touch on this evening, or if there's an opportunity to answer a couple of the questions that were asked. I see you nodding, Andrew. Would you like to go first? Thank you.
I'm happy to answer the questions. As best we can, anyway. So certainly we can say that the cost of this new voting process is borne entirely by the school district. The ballots that we'll be mailing home will be mailed with a stamped return addressed envelope. So the cost is on the district for that. We have no choice but to find the funds within the existing year's budget, and obviously we will do that. So it's a somewhat unanticipated cost, but it's one that, in light of the governor's directive, that we need to meet. I think that addresses the first two questions. Oh, well, what is the cost? That's the part that's a little tricky to determine, because we got this news on Friday, and Kim Monson and others have been working enormously hard to identify the vendors, et cetera, who can turn around a very quick and very large mailing, a fairly complicated mailing to get out to about 14,000 registered voters. So we're actually still awaiting some final proposals and costs on that. So I can't identify the exact costs of each ballot at this time. But again, the total cost will be entirely borne by the district. The question about the bus purchase, it's an interesting question and a good question. I don't actually know if we can delay. I don't know if my colleagues can speak to that. Assuming the proposition passes, is there an opportunity to not spend the money right away? I don't know the answer.
My fear in that is that the prices probably would not hold. So we probably could not get the same buses that time frame, or for those, that dollar figure.
Okay. So
we're also seeing that production for vehicles have been slowing down. So even if we do order these immediately, we might not receive them as quickly as we've received them in the past.
Okay. The only thing I can add to the conversation is that we don't, even with our existing buses, we don't allow them to sit idle for too long. We do have mechanics and others who continue working even when school's closed, and they do start the buses and make sure that they're running and in good shape for whenever we need to start back up again. So hopefully that addresses that question.
Thank you. Anybody else waiting to raise a topic or ask questions?
Marjorie, I would like to mention that in the consent agenda that the board approved, there are a number of budget transfers which the board regularly approves, and particularly at this time of year. And I do want to make mention that one of those, and we're very appreciative of it, was for a fairly significant amount, allowing us to make a purchase of additional laptops for the coming school year, which we think is an important addition in light of both in light of the current situation that we find ourselves in, but also for the future anyway. They're purchases that we most likely would have been making more slowly and over time, but with the opportunity through some savings that we see that in this current situation, we're able to make that purchase now. We think it'll be good educationally for our students. It'll provide a little bit more consistency in terms of the devices that we're able to distribute in the fall, whether we find ourselves in the same situation that we're in now or some kind of hybrid situation. We think it'll also be good in terms of health and safety, regardless of the situation we're in. When the virus first broke a few months ago, we were getting concerns expressed by parents about the sharing of devices among different students, and it's, you know, we talked a lot about the high touch points in schools that we would work to clean with much greater frequency, and certainly computer devices are one of those high touch points, so we would be working to clean them. But when they're shared among lots of different students during the day, it becomes that much more challenging. And now we would have the opportunity with this purchase to identify devices per student in the school day, so they wouldn't have to be sharing them. So we really appreciate the board's support with that, and we think it'll be a good addition. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the context, Andrew. We appreciate that. I think then that we're ready to look ahead to future meetings. And I see that the Finance Committee was scheduled to meet Tuesday, May 12th. Does somebody want to nod if that's still happening?
It's still on the schedule, but that was on my list to follow up with Kim and David on, so.
Okay, so I'll let you do that offline, no problem. Similarly, we have a standing meeting for sustainability on Friday, May 15th, and I know we're going to discuss that early next week to determine whether that meeting will hold. So we mentioned earlier that the board is going to meet on Thursday, May 28th, because that falls within the required window of time when we would need to do the formal budget hearing. So we are adding a meeting on May 28th. We also, however, had planned to meet on Thursday, May 21st. And for the time being, I'm going to suggest that we just leave this meeting on our calendar as a placeholder, as circumstances seem to be rapidly evolving. And it has been handy to us in the past to have a couple of extra meetings on the calendar. So as long as nobody else has really big competing plans for the 21st at the moment, is that okay if we keep that meeting on the 21st, add the meeting on the 28th, and if we need to or can cancel on the 21st, then we will?
Yeah.
Okie doke. Terrific. Thank you. And I think that brings us to item 21. Would somebody like to make a motion to adjourn? Thank you, Scott. Somebody want to second that? Seconded by Julia and everybody. So again, thank you so very much to everybody. Thank you to our members of the community who joined us. Thank you to the administration and to our staff for your Herculean efforts in these times. Be safe, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Take care. Good night.
All right.
Bye.